All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here. My name is Andy Pendoli. I'm part of the project team the County of San Diego has assembled for the Regional Decarbonization Framework. Before we get into more details, I'd like to introduce Diana. She's our Spanish language interpreter, and she'll be supporting us with bilingual real-time simultaneous interpretation during this workshop today. So Diana, thank you for being here. And if you could do us a favor of explaining the bilingual features that we have available for everybody here today in both English and Spanish.
Yes, thank you, Andy. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this meeting. My name is Diana, and I'll be your interpreter. In order to provide language access, this meeting will have simultaneous interpretation from English to Spanish. Please note that the interpretation globe will not appear until after I've read through all the language instructions. Therefore, we are asking that everyone joining us for this event, please select your preferred language to facilitate hearing the presenters and participants clearly and to prevent technical glitches or interference occurring between the two language channels when one is not selected. If you're on your laptop, please locate the icon shaped like a globe at the bottom of your screen, which will appear after I've read these instructions. You have to click on language interpretation and then select English. If you're on an iPad or a phone or a similar device, then you have to locate the three-dot menu on the right corner of your screen. Click on language interpretation and then select English. When you speak, please do so at a moderate pace because the interpreter is going to be simultaneously interpreting everything you say. Thank you. Buenas tardes a todos y bienvenidos a esta reunión. Me llamo Diana y seré su intérprete. Les informo que esta reunión contará con interpretación simultánea en inglés y en español. Por favor de tomar en cuenta que el globo de interpretación no va a aparecer hasta que yo haya leído las instrucciones tanto en inglés como en español. Por ende, pedimos que todos los asistentes seleccionen su idioma preferido para poder escuchar los presentadores y participantes con claridad, evitando que se produzcan fallas técnicas o interferencias entre los dos canales lingüísticos cuando no se seleccione uno de estos. Si está usando una computadora, después de mis instrucciones va a haber un icono en la parte inferior de su pantalla a la derecha en forma de globo que dice Interpretation, es decir, interpretación. Tiene que hacer clic ahí y seleccionar Spanish, es decir, español. Si está utilizando un iPad o teléfono inteligente, favor de localizar la opción de 3 puntos que va a aparecer en la esquina inferior a la derecha. Tiene que seleccionar ese y hacer clic en Language Interpretation, que significa interpretación de idiomas. Y tiene que elegir Spanish, es decir, español. Cuando sea su turno de hablar, por favor recuerde hablar con voz fuerte y clara y a un paso moderado, ya que la intérprete estará interpretando simultáneamente al otro idioma. Muchas gracias y en este momento aceptaré mi función como intérprete. Thank you, Andy.
Okay, thank you, Diana. Very good. And I want to cover just a couple more logistical items for everyone's benefit about how we'll be proceeding today. When we open up the opportunity for discussion and dialogue with all of you, question and answer, which will be the majority of our time today, there's a couple ways we'd appreciate your help in doing that. First is using the Zoom chat feature, which I think many of you are probably familiar with, but you look for the little chat icon in your Zoom controls to best do that. And then there's also the raise hand feature as well. And this helps to indicate if you'd like to speak over the audio. We can make sure you're able to unmute yourself to do that at that time when we're ready to do so as well. And so again, for those of you who might be on a smartphone right now, just showing on screen how you can find those features. Again, looking at the kind of 3 dots more button perhaps. Clicking that should open up for you the chat function and the raise hand function as well. So, and then finally, last but not least, you can also find specific controls for those of you who maybe, I don't believe we have anybody calling in only on their phone, but when we get to the Q&A and discussion portion, I'll be sure to explain a little more details about how to use those controls as well. So, all right, with those particulars out of the way, I want to more specifically welcome you and thank you for being here. So this is the next in the series of what we are called the sector workshops, where we take a deep dive into one of the specific sectors under study as part of the regional decarbonization framework. And today we are focusing on the buildings sector. So we've had sector workshops in the previous weeks, specifically on natural climate solutions and land use, on energy, and then also on transportation as well. So today we're focused on buildings. I also want to let you know that next week at this time, Thursday at 2 o'clock, we'll be focusing on jobs. So as many of you may know, there has been a significant investment in this framework, in this work, also on the nature of how the economy and particularly jobs and workforce may change. What are the challenges and opportunities faced with our workforce when it comes to decarbonization? So I want to let you know there's been a lot of great work done and specific to jobs and workforce. There's a report available on the project website. And next week at this time, we'll have the in-depth workshop focused on jobs and workforce as well. So we look forward to covering that with you then. But again, today we'll focus on buildings, and we're going to have a presentation, overview presentation of the research, the analysis that's been done to date, and the takeaways. And again, I want to stress that today is really just about looking at what this analysis and research has brought forward so far. There's no specific policy direction on the table yet. There are no decisions being made in the immediate future, but it's really an opportunity to really look closely at these results. And again, hear from you, your interpretation of these results and your thoughts on what policy decisions could be coming down the line that you feel should be on the table as part of the discussion in the weeks and months ahead. So, so please do keep that in mind as we move ahead into that. And after this brief presentation, again, we're going to spend the rest of our time hearing from all of you, hearing your questions, answering them the best our team can today. We've got a selection of team members available today to be able to do that, but also importantly, hearing your comments and thoughts and reflections, because we have questions for you too, actually, about how you're receiving and interpreting this information and your thoughts on moving forward. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce Elise Hansen with the Land Use and Environment Group here at the County of San Diego. She's going to give us that pretty thorough but relatively brief presentation, and then we'll open it up and hear from all of you. So thanks again for being here. And Elise, please go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Andy. Good afternoon. I'm Elise Hansen, and I am a management fellow in the Land Use and Environment Group, or LUJA's executive office. In addition to the LUJ team, we also have Philip Esch Gates, who is a co-author of the RDF's technical report, Chapter 4, entitled Decarbonization of Buildings. Philip is a senior associate at Synapse Energy Economics, Inc. Philip has provided invaluable contributions to this project, and he will be available to answer questions after this brief presentation. So before we begin discussing building decarbonization in the technical report, we want to start by recognizing that there are communities in the San Diego region that face unjust conditions and circumstances related to the environments in which they live. The tribal nations of the San Diego region are an example of one community that has historically faced such impacts. We would like to recognize those injustices with a land acknowledgement from our team. We acknowledge the harmony that existed between the land, nature, and its original people who have since endured displacement, persecution, and systemic oppression. We pay our respect to the unceded territory and homelands of 17 tribal nations in our region, the most of any county in the United States, from 4 cultural groups: the Kumeyaay, Diegueño, the Luiseño, the Cupeño, and the Kumeya. As climate change increasingly threatens the region, its peoples, and its cultural identities, we aspire to learn from Indigenous traditional knowledge and undoing the injustices of the past. Recognizing the need for a regional approach to addressing climate change, in January last year, the Board of Supervisors voted to create a regional decarbonization framework. This framework is intended to provide science-based pathways to inform policymaking in regional, county, and city governments towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the San Diego region. It is separate from, but complements, ongoing climate action planning efforts by local governments. The framework is a visionary document being developed collaboratively through public-private partnerships and community input. It will provide strategies and initiatives to move toward zero carbon emissions in the region. There are 3 components of the integrated framework. First, the technical report that was prepared by UC San Diego and some of the nation's leading experts on energy modeling. Today's presentation and discussion will primarily be focused on this report. Second, a workforce development study by Inclusive Economics to ensure that our local workers benefit from climate investments. And third, implementation pathways. While there will be many studies, discussions, and recommendations throughout this process, actual decarbonization results will come from the implementation of policies, programs, and projects by all of us working together. Here's our timeline. We are currently in the policy and program development phase, and there is an open comment period for the technical and workforce reports that is open through May 31st. From now through August, we will continue to work on the workforce development study and the implementation pathways. We intend to present the integrated framework with all three of these components to the board for approval. The final fully integrated framework is intended to help policymakers identify opportunities for collaboration across sectors and jurisdictional boundaries. We would like to recognize some of the commenters who provided the consultants with invaluable feedback on how to improve the chapter in terms of additional and improved analyses, data visualizations, and context. We are grateful for the time that the stakeholders took to provide feedback, which improved this analysis and the entire report. Regionally, the single largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions are, in order, on-road transportation of light-duty vehicles, electricity generation, natural gas use in buildings, and on-road transportation of heavy-duty vehicles. Together, these four emissions categories account for 80% of regional emissions. These emissions are measured in carbon dioxide equivalent, which is a way to compare the planet warming effects of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and other greenhouse gases using a single metric. To address these regional emissions, the technical report modeled pathways to decarbonization for electricity, transportation, and buildings. Additionally, the report analyzed natural climate solutions and land use considerations for regional decarbonization. This presentation will focus on the regional emissions that are produced by natural gas use in buildings and on how this sector can decarbonize. The San Diego region has a large and diverse building stock that includes a variety of residential buildings across 19 jurisdictions. This graph shows the 2021 regional residential building space in millions of square feet by jurisdiction. The green bars are single-family homes, light gray are multifamily homes, dark gray are manufactured homes, light blue are condominiums, and dark blue are 2 to 4 family homes. Among these residential buildings, there is significant end-use consumption of natural gas in the San Diego region. The San Diego region is similar to other California regions in that there is high reliance on natural gas in residential buildings. This graph shows the average annual usage of natural gas measured in therms by end use of 3 utilities, including San Diego Gas and Electric, or SDG&E, shown on the left, which services the San Diego region. This graph shows that the majority of the region's end-use natural gas consumption in residential buildings is by water heaters, shown in blue, and that space heating appliances, shown in yellow-orange, also consume large amounts of natural gas. The other end uses, including dryers, cooking appliances, and miscellaneous end uses, shown in red, green, and pink respectively, account for a relatively small fraction of the San Diego region's residential natural gas consumption. Therefore, water and space heating appliances contribute the highest share of residential building emissions of natural gas-powered residential appliances. Additionally, the region has a large, diverse commercial building stock. This graph shows the 2021 regional commercial building space in millions of square feet by jurisdiction. Red is storage, light goldenrod is service, goldenrod is retail, light green is office, dark green is miscellaneous, light blue is lodging, teal is healthcare, purple is food sales and services, light gray is education and public service, and dark gray is assembly. This graph shows the diversity of commercial building types that are contributing to regional building emissions. Similarly, the commercial building stock has a high diversity of end-use energy needs, and the specific end-use needs are highly dependent on the commercial building type and may affect the relative importance of reducing emissions from space and water heating. This graph shows the total annual energy consumption in blue at the top and shows the percentage of end-use energy consumption by building system type in the body of the graph. These bars are organized by building type, which is shown at the bottom of the graph. The commercial building stock has a larger diversity of energy demands than residential buildings, as is visible in the far left bar, which shows the total consumption for all commercial buildings. Despite the diversity of energy needs, space and water heating, shown in gray and light gray respectively, still account for approximately 30% of total energy consumption in commercial buildings. Thus, space and water heating energy consumption is also an important area for commercial building decarbonization. The chapter studied the current and projected building mix and associated emissions from the region's building sector, and it modeled ways to reach a carbon-free building sector in 2050. These scenarios were first, the central or high electrification scenario. This pathway assumes that over 95% of space heating and water heating equipment sales are fully electric by 2030 and 2032, respectively. In 2050, no residential water heating is served by gas, and only 8% of residential space heating systems are unelectrified. In this scenario, SDG&E adds about 44,000 new gas customers by 2030 and about 2,000 after. From top to bottom in this graph, these rows are the share of electric heating system sales in 2030, the share of installed residential electric heating systems in 2050, the energy efficiency of new residential heating systems in 2050, measured in coefficient of performance, or COP, and the residential commercial electricity consumption from space and water heating in 2050. The next scenario is low electricity demand, or high efficiency. In this scenario, space and water heating system sales and stock numbers match the trajectories from the central case. However, in this scenario, heat pumps are assumed to perform at higher efficiencies, thereby reducing electricity consumption and demand. The final scenario is partial electrification. This case models an alternative approach where less than half of space and water heating system sales are electric in 2030. In this case, a low carbon gas is required as a natural gas alternative to achieve decarbonization within the study period. The scenario assumes a linear increase in the use of low carbon gas starting in 2030 and reaching 100% in 2045 and later years. In this scenario, SDG&E adds about 60,000 new gas customers by 2030 and about 34,000 more by 2050. Note that the model assumes that low carbon gas is a gas that reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 95% relative to fossil gas. There are numerous high-level technical takeaways from this analysis. It is important to state that these are technical findings from UC San Diego and other contractors and do not represent recommendations to or from the county. The first key takeaway is that replacing natural gas-fueled residential space and water heating appliances with electric appliances will significantly reduce residential building emissions. This graph shows the share of fuel type as a percentage of customer accounts by residential space heating on the left and water heating on the right. This graph shows that both residential heating systems currently rely primarily on natural gas, with 69% of space heating and 82.5% of water heating systems being powered by natural gas. Replacing these systems with electrified systems will eliminate those end-use building emission sources. Note that this chapter assumes that the electricity sector is simultaneously decarbonizing according to state mandates and goals. Like residential systems, most commercial space and water heating systems are powered by natural gas. The graph on the left shows 2021 primary space heating energy sources, and the graph on the right shows primary water heating energy sources in commercial buildings. The bars show the total commercial space in millions of square feet by commercial building type per energy source. From left to right within the heating system type, the bars show systems powered by natural gas, electricity, other sources, or no heating system. Within each of these bars, the colors represent the type of commercial building. As with residential buildings, the key takeaway here is that switching from natural gas fueled space and water heating appliances to electric appliances will significantly reduce commercial building emissions. Note that some building types may be less conducive to electrification in the short term, and that office space is the single largest natural gas consumer of the commercial building types. The second key takeaway is that policies to reduce fossil fuel-based space and water heating systems with electric systems should focus on increasing uptake among low-income residents and rental building owners. This graph shows the annual cost of natural gas per customer, measured by annual revenue per customer in 2020 dollars. The red line shows the high electrification scenario, and the green line shows the partial electrification scenario. The red line shows that the cost of gas increases sharply over time as fewer and fewer customers share the total costs of natural gas infrastructure installations and upkeep. In the high electrification scenario, gas customers would pay approximately 10 times more for gas in 2050 relative to 2020. The green line also increases, though less sharply, because that scenario has more low carbon gas and natural gas consumers sharing infrastructure costs. In the partial electrification scenario, gas customers would pay approximately 4 times more for gas in 2050 relative to 2020. For reference, the dashed blue line shows the additional costs for electricity in an all-electric home. Switching from gas to electric systems would increase electricity bills, but these increases would be drastically smaller than the increases for homes with gas-powered systems, and these electric rates are expected to remain stable through 2050. As more homes electrify, the remaining homes will have higher gas bills. If the last customers to be able to switch are low income, then this decarbonization strategy will be regressive. Policies can be designed to focus on helping low income and disadvantaged homeowners to electrify and to incentivize rental property owners to electrify. Such policies would begin to address some historic inequities in housing quality, environmental injustice, health disparities due to indoor air pollution, and/or utility costs, while simultaneously ensuring that low-income residents and renters are not excluded from building decarbonization goals and that they are not left paying increasingly higher gas rates. The third key takeaway is that there are near-term actions that can advance building decarbonization goals. Among these actions, setting all electric or electric-ready building standards for new builds and major reconstructions can shift the future building stock and reduce its emissions. State building codes like Title 24 are moving toward all electric to support the 2045 state mandates to achieve carbon neutrality. So regional REACH codes and ordinances could accelerate local and regional building decarbonization. REACH codes or ordinances are local codes or ordinances that go beyond state or federal codes or ordinances. Additionally, regional policymakers can benefit from lessons learned in the adoption of all-electric REACH codes or ordinances in the cities of Carlsbad, Encinitas, and Solana Beach. The fourth key takeaway is that low-carbon gaseous fuels can be used for hard-to-electrify end uses, though research and piloting are required. Some building systems are hard to retrofit to electrify them. So one way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from those systems is to use fuels that do not emit net greenhouse gases into the atmosphere before those systems can be replaced at the end of their useful lives. Some examples may include hospitals and restaurants, which may have specialized equipment or combined heat and power systems that may be more difficult to retrofit to reduce emissions and/or electrify. This graph shows the pipeline gas consumption of the central or high electrification scenario in red, and the partial electrification scenario, which includes some low carbon gas fuels to reduce the emissions of some systems, in green. This shows that gas consumption will drastically reduce in both scenarios, but that the central case results in an earlier and greater reduction of gas consumption. This graph shows the on-site greenhouse gas emissions in millions of metric tons of carbon dioxide of the partial electrification scenario, which is the green line in the left-hand graph. So this graph of emissions shows that despite the use of gaseous fuels, the scenario still meets its decarbonization goals by 2045. Low carbon gaseous fuels could include biomethane and or hydrogen, but piloting and research are needed before implementation because each of these alternate fuels have cost and efficiency trade-offs, as well as uncertainties that need to be investigated. The fifth key takeaway is that minimizing unnecessary natural gas infrastructure extensions or replacements and accelerating existing asset depreciation can mitigate gas utility risk, including stranded cost risk. Stranded assets or infrastructure that has stopped being used before reaching the end of its useful life can cause significant financial losses for utilities. For companies like SDG&E, stranded assets represent potential financial losses because of the high capital costs of installing or replacing gas infrastructure. Mitigating these stranded assets will be an important policy consideration. Two primary tools to minimize stranded cost risk are to, one, not add more natural gas customers to the customer base, and two, to minimize unnecessary extensions or replacements of gas pipeline infrastructure. SDG&E invests in natural gas assets when it extends pipes to serve new customers and when it replaces old or damaged pipes and other assets. This graph shows the savings for a utility if replacements alone were reduced, which is the blue line, and if replacements were reduced and no new customers were added, which is the purple line. These are both relative to no utility action in the high electrification scenario, which is in red. The graph shows that the utility rate base in millions of 2020 dollars over time for providing gas to customers. Another tactic to avoid stranded costs is for utilities to retire gas infrastructure rather than replace that infrastructure and allow the buildings served by that gas infrastructure to become all electric. This is referred to as targeted electrification. This graph shows the gas utility delivery revenue requirement in millions of 2020 dollars. The revenue requirement is the amount of money that the utility must collect from customers each year to pay for that year's depreciation of its assets, cover its operating costs, and leave a just and reasonable return on invested capital for its bondholders and shareholders. The modeled targeted electrification system is shown in blue, and the high electrification scenario is shown in red. Note that the targeted electrification results also include no new customer additions. This shows that retiring gas infrastructure in a targeted way will lead to cost savings for the utility and thus for the customers. Overall, policies like requiring all new construction to be fully electric would mitigate stranded asset losses for new pipe investments going to new customers, but this would not mitigate losses from investing in replacing aging infrastructure. Exploring and piloting non-pipeline alternatives to both new and replacement infrastructure, including electrifying end use instead of replacing infrastructure, could identify opportunities to mitigate risk. The final key takeaway is that decarbonizing existing buildings is critical to decarbonizing the building sector. 80% of buildings that will exist in the region in 2050 have already been built. As such, the emissions from these buildings will continue into the future if they are not addressed with specific actions and policies. One such action is replacing end-of-life systems, which is assumed in the chapter's modeling and is also the lowest cost strategy. Other near-term actions and policies could include decarbonizing existing municipal buildings because implementing cost-effective measures and electrifying those buildings may help reduce operating costs for the municipal buildings, and because modeling these actions may encourage residential and commercial building owners to act. Finally, here are some broad conclusions to this chapter. This chapter modeled pathways to zero on-site emissions under 3 scenarios. The focus was on electrifying space and water heating systems in the region's building stock because these systems are responsible for the majority of residential emissions and many commercial emissions. Electrification will be required for new and existing buildings. Setting all electric reach codes will accelerate regional building decarbonization, but some systems may be difficult to retrofit and may therefore benefit from low carbon gaseous fuels prior to replacement. Electrification policies should focus on equity. Low income and rental households will have more difficulty in electrifying without dedicated policies, and they will subsequently be left paying increasingly high gas rates as electrification continues. Additionally, many low income and rental communities also face disproportionately high impacts of climate change and air pollution. Policies that help these communities to electrify will help to address some of these historic inequities. Understanding the economics facing utility companies is central to understanding how electrification and building decarbonization can occur. That concludes our presentation, and we are happy to take your questions.
All right, thank you very much, Elise, for that extensive presentation. A lot of takeaways with building decarbonization here, as you can see. Before we get into that, again, just a quick reminder for those who may have joined us during the presentation. We're going to dedicate the rest of our time here with you this afternoon to hearing from all of you, answering your questions, hearing your comments, and we have some questions for you just to help kind of frame the conversation as well. But again, want to encourage you all two main ways. Again, the chat, which is already well in use. We appreciate all of you for doing that. By the way, the Zoom chat is really helpful for us from the context of this workshop, and that we can really, it automatically records the comments and thoughts and conversation that we're having. So that's really valuable. Please continue to use it. But again, we welcome anyone who'd like to speak over the audio. If you use the Zoom raise hand feature, or if you're having trouble with that at all, just you can type into the chat that you'd like to speak over the audio, and we can call upon you that way, and then we can make sure you're able to unmute yourself at that time to be able to chat, and we can make sure we're not talking over each other with muting and unmuting as well. So again, and those of you who may be on a smartphone, again, you can find the chat and the raise hand feature from the More button, maybe a 3-dot button that you'd see on your Zoom controls to pull those up as well. I do also want to note too, we may have one or two people I noticed come on into the meeting by phone line. Maybe they're not still here anywhere, but let me just stress for all of you anyway, if and when you're on a phone line only and you have to use the keypad controls, if at the point you'd like to speak, it'll be *6 to mute or unmute, and then *9 will use the Zoom raise hand feature. To raise or lower your Zoom hand, and that way we can see you'd like to speak. So anybody who might be just only on their phone using the keypad and listening, those are the way to do that. So good. Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank the team. They're already well into answering questions that you've posted in the chat. So hopefully you all have been following along there. Seeing a lot of good questions coming in. And we'll, if team members have more to expand on answering those questions, they'll be happy to do that. So. And again, appreciate all your detailed comments that you're offering in response to some of the takeaways. And let me just kind of start off posing this question to all of you as well. But in just acknowledging that state mandates, requirements, codes, and ordinances are leading on building electrification. What opportunities do you see for action at the state level to affect regional building electrification and decarbonization? What are things that you're seeing either happening now, or you anticipate to occur, or you think need to be spurred to encourage into action, either through advocacy organizations like many of you represent, if not from a local or county government advocating upwards through representatives to the state, for example? We'd love to hear more of your thoughts on state mandates and such. So again, wanted to thank you for all the ongoing kind of conversation as it is in the chat. Thank the team for starting to answer questions overall. And I see here, Carl, good to see you back. Thank you for being a consistent, ongoing participant here. Yeah, let's go ahead and, I want to acknowledge a lot of detailed comments and thoughts from you in the chat, so appreciate that. but did you want to kind of build on there? And would love to hear whatever you wanted to share now over audio, go for it. But do let us know thoughts about advocacy action at the state level. So please.
Sure.
Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, let me try to address that. That's a good question. What we've seen is that CEC has shown very clearly that they're moving towards full building electrification. But what we also have seen is that they're doing it in a very measured, slow format, even for new construction, which is not helpful at all in our ability to address climate crisis quickly. So in the newest code revision, they're all but saying all electric except not quite. And they've all but guaranteed that in the next cycle, so 3 years on from this new cycle, they will be all electric. And so it's very frustrating to see the state acknowledge that this is where they're going and take such slow steps. That's not what we need. We need everyone to have a very clear direction that this is the direction we're going. It helps workers, right? It helps our utilities understand what's up. Because when they fail to acknowledge that, they scramble for ways to, we're still going to use this, right, folks? And that's not helpful. We need everyone to be clear that the state has already addressed this, and we are clearly going towards building electrification. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So a little bit more substantive in their direction setting and that funneling down at the local level. So very good. And yeah, I see Ann noting in the chat as well, CEC mandating all electric for new construction, and encouraging that, for example. So very good. Thank you. And then Bill Tippett, I see you here. You should be able to unmute. Go ahead. What are your thoughts? Any thoughts you want to share? But again, your thoughts from the state level as well. What's is or isn't happening that you suggest needs to happen?
I guess I'll support Carl's comments first. I think you really do, the state needs to take a bigger role in this, but a lot of things have to happen at the local level. And so I'm going to focus on that. One of the things you really focused on in your presentation was this issue of stranded costs to the utility. But, there's a huge, quote, stranded cost to the individuals if they're being told to replace, functional gas heaters and all the rest, and to buy new heat pumps and all that, because it's extremely expensive for most people. And if you really want to achieve equity, how are you going to do that? One of the things that I've suggested is there should be, at all point of sale of all buildings, residential or commercial, it should be a mandatory energy audit, so that everybody knows, what they're paying and what the future costs are, and then they can make a better decision about whether it makes more sense to bite the bullet and to do some of the switch outs, transitioning to electric versus keeping their gas. And I think that would really be helpful if part of the pathway for building energy would be sort of a across the board energy audit for everything. I think at the same time, the county and the cities need to find some way to be able to fund some of that equity issues so that those who really can't afford $25,000 to switch out could have some kinds of subsidies. Another thing is that at the point of sale, consistent with the targets that the county and the cities have established, there ought to be some requirement at the point of sale that a certain percentage of the, quote, excessive energy use has to be paid for. So you could do it at the point of sale, add it to the cost of a building or a house, which would probably be like 2% of even a residential house at $850,000 or $850,000 of the average price now for a house. So the additional $23,000, $25,000 to do a lot of these retrofits, if it's at the point of sale, wouldn't be nearly so onerous as to have people pay that stuff when they're still living in their houses. So just a lot of things I think that could be put into public policy that would really be helpful.
Great, Bill. Thank you very much. And good examples of what we're looking for as we digest these takeaways. Your all individual collective thoughts about how those could inform potential policy decisions. So appreciate these range of ideas here. And Bill, you're speaking to equity as well as was noted in the presentation. Equity is a huge consideration when it just in many aspects. Of many of you have been part of this conversation broadly with decarbonization, but when it comes to buildings, we know it's very clearly there can easily be disproportionate impacts to low-income historically disadvantaged communities that need to be addressed and considered very closely. So very good. Thank you for that. We'll look forward to more thoughts from all of you along those lines. So appreciating more comments here. A lot of good details here. For example, Corey's suggestion about reducing electricity rates from the state level by reducing the impact of wildfire low-income NEM on general rates. So lower electric rate could help encourage shifting to retrofits. So thank you for that. Let's continue on here. I see a couple more Zoom hands. Bob Leiter, please, thanks for coming back. What further thoughts here on what we could try and encourage more from the state level to help us here at the regional level?
Well, I think both Carl and Bill made excellent points regarding the importance of really aggressive policies and assumptions in this analysis regarding building electrification. And it seems to me the scenarios that you all tested don't go nearly far enough in terms of more or less assuming full electrification of all new buildings. And I would say, at least for economic analysis, for cost benefit analysis, assuming that all existing buildings are converted to all electric by a date certain. And I think that what the state could do on all that is to adopt more aggressive code requirements for new construction and impose policies. Perhaps this would require legislation, but policies that would require that upon sale of property, a property be converted to all electric. And I'm not saying I know what the economic impacts of that are, but right now I don't think we do know that from your studies. And I think it would be really helpful to have an analysis of a scenario that would make those assumptions.
Okay, great, Bob, thank you, appreciate that. And wanted to acknowledge, I think in a similar vein where you were, Bob, you were just going, and Feeney was just suggesting also in the chat around mandating electric new construction sooner than later, noting Washington State has done something similar around electric, water, and space heating for new multifamily non-residential. So good, and Bob, thank you, for those more specific suggestions. That's really helpful. And I also wanted to acknowledge too, as Bob, as you noted, with everything that's been analyzed today, data collected as part of this framework, there's still, those of you particularly come from academia or more recently or are in it, there are always continued questions to study and research questions to study and analyze. So we appreciate you bringing that forward too. What else should we be diving into and considering? Maybe it may or may not be immediate, but again, what can we put on our ahead, for future analysis and study? Hopefully not too far away, hopefully. So Tracy Morgan Hollingworth, thank you for being here. You should be able to unmute here and speak over the audio. What are your thoughts here from the state level or other thoughts? And Tracy, as you're speaking, just for the benefit of the group, I'll bring up another question on screen to spur more conversation. But Tracy, please, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. What we've been running into, and I work with the Association of Realtors, is it's not always easy to get a home buyer to understand whether there's a real return on investment in some of these technologies. Case in point is solar, because solar has become more prevalent. A buyer is not necessarily going to offer, to a higher level of the cost just because a seller has installed solar, and they're denying that there's a real return on investment. So if you can prove there's a return on investment, heat pumps are relatively noisy. They're not necessarily going to be your next door neighbor's favorite installation. Solar water heaters are really expensive if you're not solarizing everything else. And so you've got to, help the industry understand how to sell it. And if they can't sell it, then you're going to have a lot of people who will fall out of sales. There's a statistic that our state association uses. Anytime you raise the cost by $100,000, you lose that many buyers out there that can afford to buy that home. And so And right now the market's great, it's hot, but when the market starts to dip, you're going to have a lot more people who will not be willing or able financially to do those retrofits.
Right.
Just FYI.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. So again, thinking about that, balance of encouragement versus requirement, again, equity issues, just practicalities, affordability, if not for those with the most limited means and resources, but again, even a broader aspects of the housing market, for example, and access and opportunities to for getting into homes, essentially. So thank you again. Just another example, Tracy, thank you, of kind of the complexities around some of these considerations and decisions and what sort of balance and trade-offs we need to be thoughtful about. Is really helpful to the study. So thank you for that. So wanted to also acknowledge here kind of a new question on screen here to further spur reaction and thoughts, conversation from all of you overall. So again, acknowledging that, the analysis, data is showing that we can move building decarbonization more rapidly with improved technologies and innovations overall. So, what are the opportunities you see related to technology and innovation in the building sector? What some of which I at least touched on in the overview presentation. Anything you feel is not being discussed or not on the table that should be discussed, maybe that you'd suggest needs more research, either maybe whether that's private driven, maybe public supported. Again, broader range of options and opportunities here. Would love to hear from all of you. So again, whether that's heat pump water technology overall, but also Carl, yeah, please go ahead and you should be, I think you're unmuted, Carl. You can go ahead and unmute. Yeah, I know you're just noticing here, advanced variable capacity heat pumps, for example. So yeah, please, Carl, what are your thoughts here about technologies and innovations?
Yeah, so innovation is one of those pet peeve words for me, because when people talk about innovation, they're generally talking about, let's wait 10 more years to see what will happen, what new technologies will save us from having to have a system change. But I do want to acknowledge the fact that heat pumps have been used all over the world for many, many years. This is not a new technology at all. Now they have advanced, they've gotten better, but even the best heat pumps, they've been using that same technology for over 10 years. So there's nothing new, and we don't need anything new in terms of this building electrification chapter that we're talking about today. No new innovation is necessary. We can do all of this now. What we will have to do is improve our capacity to manufacture this stuff in the volume that we're going to need it. We need to make sure that the quality control is high, because we've seen some problems with some of the heat pump manufacturers not giving out their best quality that they could. But I don't think that we need to wait for innovation. I think we need to be careful and guard against using the terms innovation and future innovation, because that really puts people in a stall mode. They're told, just wait for a few more years and watch for those things to get better or become cheaper. And we just don't have time for that. Thank you.
All right, Carl, thank you very much. And I want to acknowledge that there are others here agreeing with that sentiment. I'm seeing in the chat here overall, we have the technology, some technologies at least as available now. Would love to hear more from you. So for instance, heat pumps, we just having that conversation in the last few minutes here. Please want to continue to hear from all of you. What are those technologies kind of available today that you would suggest are just not being more widely used or could be more widely used? I'm seeing another comment around looking at incentivizing, what public incentives could be around, for instance, HVAC systems for large scale multifamily non-residential to make them more viable and as Craig notes, hopefully more cost effective in those settings. So yeah, again, existing technologies, still anything that you see coming down the road or that we should look forward to, but also yeah, and maybe combinations of incentives that might further support more quicker implementation and use of those technologies. So very good. So yeah, and the equity around how we distribute those, absolutely. So along those lines, because you've already all been touching on it, many of you, sorry, have been touching on this as well. Let me introduce another question here on screen. Again, as we've noted, and many of you have supported equity considerations, just in multi-layered, multi-factor considerations here. But what do you, from an opportunity perspective, how can we advance equity to decarbonize buildings. Again, being very cautious and thoughtful about, you know, what the trade-offs and rollout of decarbonization buildings can mean for those who have been underrepresented or lack the resources. We don't want them to be the last one standing, you know, last one standing, if you will, in terms of dealing with the cost implications alone, for example, of being the last users of natural gas. So again, what can we do from an opportunity framing about, you know, further supporting equity and addressing equity concerns? So, so yeah, promoting programs to improve indoor air quality with zero emission appliances, as Corey suggested, thank you. Ground source heat pump technology. And Larry, your note, by the way, that Title 24 in the specific case of ground source heat pumps technology is not supportive. Appreciate that feedback as well. What else do we need to think about with existing policy framework and considerations that may be holding back, you know, or disincentivizing, you know, use of existing technologies and innovations. So, and Fabi, thank you. Absolutely. Let's ask communities what would work for them, what's important and most critical in the context of decarbonization in buildings in all aspects of our economy. So very good. Excellent. So happy to hear from anyone else over the audio. Would love to hear from others. I appreciate a few of you who've been consistent commenters over the audio. Want to encourage all of you to take the opportunity to use the audio feature to share any thoughts and ideas and comments as well. But again, do appreciate all the chat comments as well. It helps us for recording perspectives as well. So let me come to, and Murtaza, if you don't mind, maybe you can, if you wanted to come on to share a few things in a moment, Murtaza, sorry, but if you wanted to share any further follow-up to any points that have come on, or if you feel any team members could add some more information beyond what's been in the chat, it'd be great. But I see Dalin Young, you should be able to unmute yourself and go ahead and share. What are your thoughts here around any of the questions we posed, or further thoughts or questions that you may have? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. And frankly, I don't know if I have the answer. I'm kind of hoping that y'all would come up with this as we move forward with this RDF. But and I think somebody stated it in the chat earlier, but I did just want to advance this. I think we're talking about providing incentives and all that kind of stuff for equity for low-income folks. But I don't know if it's been stressed so much in here that a lot of those low-income folks are probably renters. And so if they're going to be moving around from building to building and all that kind of stuff, it's probably not, I think, in their purview or, you know, and or their responsibility to be able to afford those heat pumps. It seems like something more that, you know, landlords and, you know, property management companies are going to need the incentives to do. But then I guess on the flip side of that, how do you do it in such a way that you're not increasing the value of those homes that is there to benefit the property owner versus the renter? So I don't have the right answer, unfortunately. I think this is a larger question overall, but yeah, I did just want to highlight that, especially with you know, even today, as somebody talked earlier about the higher median income for homes, it just prices out so many people. So I think more and more people are falling to that trap of not being able to purchase those, or even if they had the desire to purchase a heat pump or something like that, they're still renting and going to be stuck in that for a while. Absolutely. So thank you for the time.
Certainly, Don. Thank you for that. I know no one's required to have all the answers for us here today, but I appreciate you posing the question, Aspie. And I see Cheryl also in the chat. I think reinforces your point as well, that there is it's not just about home ownership, being able to afford, you know, this, you know, decarbonizing in the sense of home ownership, but also even still with renters, you know, those costs being passed on to them, and they're already experiencing, you know, the challenges of you know, cost of living in general, including with energy overall. So so yeah, thank you for that, and thanks for Cheryl for also mentioning that as well. You know, retrofit costs being passed on to renters, you know, whether it's a heat pump or other aspects, how those cost dynamics are, you know, to what degree they are passed on to the renters themselves, as opposed to just the property owners, and, you know, what further burdens might they be should we anticipate they'd experience, and what can we do to try and address that, mitigate that to the greatest extent possible. So all of these specific details are really helpful for us to have on the table to think about, trying to address this proactively, as opposed to hurrying up and trying to solve the problems after they're already occurring in the future. So yeah, please, more thoughts on equity considerations. Be great to hear from more people. But yeah, Carl, go ahead. What else do you have? What are your further thoughts on the equity considerations?
Yeah, sure. In regards to equity, one of the things that folks don't often consider is that these appliances all do burn out eventually. And although there are definitely costs associated with electrifying a gas appliance, you may have to run new electric lines, you may have to recite an appliance. The overall problem of going through an entire house and getting all the appliances out on day one, as Bill mentioned, $20,000 or $30,000 expense, that is something that will incur too much cost to most people. And so the concept of a burnout ordinance or a plan to decarbonize all buildings by a certain date, that really encourages the contractors, all the property owners, everyone to understand this is my time when I can no longer be operating my gas appliance. And it starts setting them on the path of replacing burned out gas appliances with electric appliances without having the burden of having to do the whole building at once. There are economies of scale with doing an entire building, but you can also do it piecemeal if that helps homeowners.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you for that. Absolutely. Kind of approaches to how do we face things? How can we help to just manage these costs and the implications, and if or how they funnel down to others. So very much. And again, good thoughts and comments here, Bob. We'll bring you on here over the audio here just in a moment. But I see your comment as well that there's an example in Riverside County with a new housing developments installing solar that can help with cheaper electricity. And Wendy, thank you, that affordable housing developers build electric and it is cheaper to build and operate from that view and perspective. Thank you, Wendy, for that. Happy to hear more examples from all of you like that about what's already happening today and or where there's already change happening. So Bob, go ahead. What else did you want to offer here in the context of kind of equity or other thoughts?
Yeah, I think another idea to consider, the County of San Diego and the other municipalities all build and rehabilitate buildings of their own, and many of them are located in disadvantaged communities. And so maybe one thing that the County of San Diego as a municipal government could do is to establish a policy where either the replacement of or construction of new buildings be done all electric. And I know there are older park buildings and libraries and other municipal buildings in some of the disadvantaged communities in the unincorporated area, where if the county were to obtain funding to upgrade the library or a park community center and could make it all electric, that would be a double benefit to that particular community.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Good, Bob. Thank you. Yeah, so kind of a good old-fashioned leading by example, if you will, from policy development, and then the facilities and infrastructure that are owned by a public agency such as the county and or any other cities in our jurisdiction can help to further kickstart and model what this can and should be, right? Overall, when it comes to decarbonizing facilities. So thank you for that. And I want to acknowledge Philip H. Gates with Synapse is part of the project team. He's been providing a lot of reflection and responses to some specific questions and comments in the chat. So I wanted to thank you, Philip, for that. But I want to go ahead and Murtaza Baksamusa, who many of you know with the County of San Diego, wanted to also offer a little more thoughts and reflections here based on the great conversation and discussion from all of you. Murtaza, what did you want to just kind of share with the group?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. I just want to build up a little bit on Bob's comment about what is it that we can do. The county has about 7 buildings so far, new construction that has been net zero energy, and the commitment to going forward, all new buildings be net zero energy. However, the challenge is the existing building stock. And as we go towards major retrofits, sometimes as we go through a major retrofit, we can make a commitment going forward for that by 2030 to ensure that some of like our carbon footprint from operations of facilities is significantly reduced, so that it aligns with the RDF. So that's part of leading by example. I think the state of California has set similar goals for existing retrofits too. If we are the public sector is a market participant as well, so it does set somewhat in the commercial space and in the kind of high visibility examples to set these examples. One thing that's missing from this conversation oftentimes is we focus a lot on operational carbon dioxide emissions, and we also need to, as we think a little bit more, think about the carbon content, recycled content. We've started putting in our newest bid that went out consideration for recycled content, so that we can, for example, concrete emissions now also cause a lot of debris, construction debris to land up in our waste landfills. If we can minimize that, we need to think about whole life cycle carbon impact of buildings. And with that, I think those are kind of my key thoughts is we can lead if we have pretty significant support, but nonetheless, we're a market participant. Then I want to, before I pass it on to Philip, say that as part of market, we are in San Diego, part of the larger market statewide in terms of the standards that CEC, for example, sets on appliances, on heating appliances, and sometimes at a national level. So we're part of that market and we are part of the regulatory system. So if you can indulge me, I'll pass it on to Philip to talk a little bit of details of what is meant by San Diego's not like an island. All our costs are kind of related to what is going on in the regulatory and market space at a statewide level.
Thank you, and those are great comments. I would note that I think there's been some really good feedback from the stakeholders just on that specific comment, Mirza, particularly related to Title 24, that there's a statewide initiative towards advancing the building related energy codes. And there's a lot of work that can be done locally on buildings. In fact, there are REACH codes that can be adopted, and 3 jurisdictions within the region have already adopted stretch codes that advance electrification or other energy related requirements. But also partnering with those existing state level stakeholders and regulators can sort of leverage and improve the impact of local actors. I think that comment also applies more broadly to the broader market for and the regional implementation of these technologies in buildings as you start to build momentum towards deployment of low carbon technologies in the San Diego region. Other regions adjacent will also follow suit as the contractor and workforce base begins to incorporate those skill sets at a greater level, and likewise it can be sort of a virtuous feedback cycle whereby those locales can also have a positive influence and spillover effects on the San Diego region. I think the comments about equity that we've seen in the chat and heard from all of you who've spoken have been really well taken, and I think dovetail nicely with portions of the regional decarbonization framework, and also encourage it to go farther. And would just note that there's a lot of opportunity to improve the built environment for those most in need, not only reducing costs, but improving indoor air quality, improving resilience against heat-related illness as our climate warms, and other sort of related co-benefits from improving our building stock and reducing the level of pollution in buildings associated with fossil fuel combustion.
Very good. Thank you, Philip Mirza, for those reflections and a little more context and perspective. It's very helpful. And yeah, much has been talked about and discussed, and we know there's more to address and bring forward related to equity again in these considerations. And I know, Cheryl, appreciate your recent comment here in the chat around essentially, education, broader community education, with an equity lens certainly, but I think broader community as well, being really clear about the benefits and opportunities and essential needs that all decisions we as individual consumers make can contribute and will contribute to if and how we're decarbonizing our region as it is. So thank you. So I'm going to encourage more comments and thoughts that you all may have. And just as a reminder, we have until 4 o'clock today. We're happy to use all that time. Also happy to wrap things up early if we've heard from everybody who wanted to share comments and ideas. I wanted to just take an opportunity here for those of you not as familiar with the process and upcoming schedule and next steps to give you an overview of what those steps are. First of all, here, as you see on the left side, starting second in, we're here as a sector workshop focused on buildings here on April 28th. Next week, we have our 5th and final sector workshop focused on jobs, workforce development. So we know that's been great interest and concern to many folks in many aspects of decarbonization. So we're looking forward to having a detailed overview of the findings and key takeaways from that analysis that's been done. So please do join us at 2 o'clock next Thursday, May 5th, to hear more about that. But also on the far left, you see, again, community meetings. We're, again, continuing to try and reach to a broader audience. I know many of you here have been involved to different degrees in the decarbonization conversation, which is, we really appreciate, again, trying to reach a more broader audience of our region. So that's what those community meetings are about. Not quite as technically detailed as we've been hearing today in these other sector workshops, but speaking more at a higher level for broader community education. I want to encourage and thank all of you who've been helping to get the word out to broader audiences to encourage them to engage and participate. But the speaker series, we're also anticipating that for June and July. Stay tuned for announcements. You see the dates here that we have: June 2, 16, July 7 and 21, that we're anticipating out for either further outside experts to kind of just come to the table and share more perspectives and experiences happening in other regions, other metropolitan areas across the United States, if not perhaps a little more internationally, just for more consideration for all of us here locally. Direct engagement meetings and presentations are ongoing and happening as requested with specific interest groups to have closer conversations about different ideas and thoughts. So, but also pop-up community events where we're getting out in the community, street fairs, farmers markets, connecting with, again, average community members to make sure they're aware of the RDF and how they can be informed and involved in this process. And then we're looking forward ahead, as I know many of you are, taking all this research and these findings and starting to talk about applied policymaking, decision-making in this region, not just the County of San Diego, but all jurisdictions. And these regional convenings for implementation are intended to do that, to really bring forward the full breadth and range of policymakers to really start to look closely at what implementation can or should look like, and where perhaps commitments can start to be made at those levels at each jurisdictional level. So look forward to that into the late summer. Stay tuned in the process overall to do that. So so very good. So with that, I'll come back to our question here around equity, but any and all conversation, I'm sorry, any and all topics related to building decarbonization, still happy to hear from all of you by all means. So, and I appreciate, again, continued conversation in the chat here around ongoing challenges that we have to address. I appreciate that not everybody has the answer to some of these issues. We do want to make sure we're clear about those challenges and contexts that have to be studied and addressed more closely and intentionally. So thank you all for bringing that forward. Bill Tippett, appreciate you, speaking to more context around the challenges here about getting to 100% electrification overall. Appreciate that. And then Hope Nelson, thank you for your comments overall. But yes, continuing to stress around the county's infrastructure and properties, as Murtaza was speaking to. By all means, I know the county government is looking very closely what it can do overall, and encouraging all jurisdictions to do the same as well, because there's acknowledgement here. This is not just a effort that's going to be solved by the county government alone. It's going to take every jurisdiction participation and engagement. So very much so. Good. So let's see, Bob Leiter, please come on back up. What's on the audio, I should say. What else did you want to share here, Bob?
Well, if it's appropriate, I'd like to go back to a couple of the slides that Elise presented at the beginning of the meeting.
Yeah, we could bring those back up. Let us know. Is there a specific one you want to look at?
Well, the one was laid out the assumptions for the three alternatives that were analyzed with regard to buildings.
Yep.
And I had a question on that.
Sure. Stand by. Hang on one second, Bob. And let me get it up, and then Elise and team. That's strange. But Bob, if you don't mind, I will get it up. I'm having a hard time finding it again. But what can you dive into your question specifically?
Well, it's difficult without having the slide in front of us.
Found it.
Basically,
Sorry,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Here we go. I've got it here, Bob.
Oh, great.
Okay,
Thank
there we
you.
go. This is the one, right?
I don't see it.
Stand by a second here.
Okay, yeah. So the number one alternative that was studied or scenario was called central high electrification.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, I have two questions. Why is it assumed in this one that there would be some new gas customers between 2030 and 2050? And therefore, there would be a slight decrease in electrified systems as a whole. I'm not clear why that would be in alternative scenario one.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Maybe let's see, I'm kind of looking to Elise and Murtaza. Maybe if you don't have the immediate answer, we can ask one of our team members too. Elise, what are your thoughts? Can you reply?
My apologies, Bob. That is a typo. It should not say slight decrease. It should say it's essentially just the share of installed systems is not quite 100% in that scenario by 2050. So my apologies on that. And I post the slides, I'll fix that.
Well, and the question was also though, why do you expect that there would be more new gas customers between 2030 and 2050 if we're moving toward an all electric building approach?
Philip, would you be willing to answer that one?
Yes, happily. Thanks. That is a good question, Bob. And I would note that there are some interconnection permits to the gas system already underway, and there's a certain momentum to the existing system. And we tried to capture that in the modeling scenario. And I would also note, and I believe we have a slide, a few slides down in the presentation that notes that we also studied sort of the targeted electrification approach to each of these three scenarios, and find that there is opportunity to reduce the unnecessary new interconnections and extensions of the existing gas system, and that the overall costs for the utility rate base would be reduced in association with that. And let me see if I can identify which slide that is. Yeah. I believe we're looking at slide 20, if it's possible to pull that one up.
Sure. This one here, Philip?
Rather 5 slides down from that. I've got my numbering off, apologies.
Here, Philip?
Key takeaway number 5.
Ah, okay. Is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
This one here? Okay. There you go.
So we looked at, for the central sort of high electrification scenario, continuing that with that sort of existing system inertia or momentum. And then we studied if you were to reduce the quantity of replacements of existing gas infrastructure, that's sort of the teal line that you see below that, and opportunities to prevent new customer additions, the impact that that would have on the utility rate base. So we did explore all of these sort of sensitivities within each of the three scenarios. And you can see the associated outcomes.
This was a graph that I had another question on. I think it was mentioned in this presenting this slide that it's assumed that the ratepayers would be paying the additional costs associated with the central high electrification alternative. And my question is, why is it assumed that the ratepayers would cover those costs? Wouldn't at least part of the costs also be covered by the stockholders of the utility that is has basically been making assumptions about the shift to all electric buildings, and if those assumptions are incorrect, it would seem like that was in response to a business decision. And I'd like to ask you either in this meeting or maybe in your next draft of the report to explain better how you made the assumptions that led to your analysis here.
Sure, and I can speak to that, team, if that's all right. I think we assumed the existing regulatory framework under the Public Utility Commission's for utility rate recovery. And I think your point is really good, Bob, that if the Public Utility Commission were to deem investments made by a utility as imprudent, then it might have the ability to disallow those investments, and those could be removed from the utility rate base. We didn't wager an opinion on decisions by the Public Utility Commission with respect to these three scenarios. We sort of assumed that the existing regulatory framework would remain intact, and that the utility would not be making decisions that were imprudent. But if the Utility Commission were to deem investments as such, then that could affect the rate base, and for example, some investments could be removed, and those would then fall presumably to the investors, the stockholders, or other parties other than the ratepayer.
Well, thanks for that explanation. And just as a follow-up to that, my comment would be, it might be worthwhile then for there to be another scenario developed where it is assumed that both the Public Utilities Commission and the California Energy Commission reevaluate their current policies and standards in light of the climate crisis, and perhaps recognize that some of the business decisions that public utilities and homeowners and building owners have been making were ill-advised. And again, look at the costs and benefits of that more aggressive implementation of all electric buildings. Again, just so you can have a good comparison of that with the other alternatives.
Very good, Bob. Appreciate it. Yeah, it really goes along with our first facilitative question we had asked. What you all see as kind of opportunities at the state level, because knowing we can do much here at the regional level, but still to some extent we are, state policy frameworks will dictate to some extent what can or can't be done in different contexts and decision-making frameworks. So Bob, thank you for that. And thanks, and Phil, thank you for helping to circle back and help to unpack some of these assumptions overall. And Bob, point well taken that maybe scenarios can be expanded to think about policy changes that could inform further change and how decarbonization can move more effectively or quickly, as the case might be. So thank you. And wanted to also acknowledge, Mark and Carl, I think your comment in the chat, perhaps, dare I say, kind of goes along those lines around responsibility and what utilities may or may not be allowed to assume and presume in terms of with their franchise agreements. And then, Anne, thank you for the thought about training for installers and contractors about heat pump water heaters and increasing their familiarity with technologies. And again, another example, it really has to be a multi-pronged strategy, whether that's a combination of policy, incentives, training and expertise, and capacity building, jobs development, workforce development. It's going to take a very layered approach here to be able to move the needle, move things forward overall. So great, thank you all very much. So again, wanted to acknowledge we have until as late as 4. I want to encourage you now, if you do have additional thoughts or comments or questions, please bring those forward now. We won't necessarily just kind of stay on until 4, listening to crickets collectively. Please do bring those ideas forward now. The team is happy to hear those and answer those comments and questions, but we'll also be respectful of our collective time here as well. If we've been able to hear from all of you today, to the extent you wanted to share thoughts and ideas so far, we're happy to wrap up a little early. In just a few seconds, we'll, again, in the chat, we'll place the link to the project website, as well as the email address where you can continue to stay in touch with the project team. You'll see that up here shortly. There it is, from Joey Nielsen. So please do encourage that. Also, again, want to encourage, you can find the detailed reports that have been informing. You've been receiving summaries in these presentations, in these sector workshops from these sector, these detailed analyses by the sector. All this is available on the project website, particularly through the engage portion. If you go to the website, you can connect to find these reports and dive deeper into the data, the analyses that have been brought forward and been summarized here today by Elise and Philip, to spend more time, look more closely. So thank you. I see a new question from Janelle. Thank you, about life cycle for new construction, and specifically limiting the amount of waste and carbon production that occurs when buildings go up. So, so during construction, maybe I'll come to Philip, if you don't mind. Is there any existing data on that that's informed what we have so far, or any kind of future research questions that you think might be emerging?
Sure, yeah, thank you. This is a great question, and I think Mirza had some relevant comments on this earlier, but I'll try to focus on other, building upon that. We did not explore in quantitative detail the opportunities and savings associated with changing building practices and building materials to low embodied carbon materials. Though you'll see in the report there are some thoughts on that, and pointing to approaches that local policymakers could consider by adopting buy clean policies. We point to Marin County's low carbon concrete code, and the work of state regulators, including the Buy Clean California Act. And so we think there is a lot of opportunity there, and would consider this the leaping off point for that discussion.
Great, very good. And others, we encourage you. Janelle, thank you for the question, and Phil, thanks for the answer. As Phil just mentioned a couple examples from Marin and others, we welcome hearing from all of you where you think are other good examples. Please share those with us here now, and if not in the workshop, following up over email as we continue forward. Again, we've got a really great crack team, Philip, Elise, many others who've been contributing and will continue to do so, but we do welcome that sources of data and policies that you're seeing out in other areas that you think are good examples that you'd like to have included here. So very much so. And then I see one more follow-up question from Bob. Philip, I'll ask you to come back if you don't mind, on the full electrification scenario, including all public agencies. So beyond just a city or a county, I see school districts, universities, et cetera, all electric by the horizon year. Is that part of the assumption?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we did not, I will say, we did not differentiate the building stock in detail by the agency which owned it. I think there is a question about regulatory authority. What we've seen in other states, and I'll need to brush up on the California context, but the ability of a local jurisdiction to regulate, to put in place a regulation that affects state and also federal agencies. In some cases, that goes beyond the local jurisdiction's authority. So we'll need to check our the particulars of that. It may not be within local regulators' authority.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm certainly not a policy expert in that too, but that's a good point, Philip. In fact, Bob, I'd almost pose that back to you, Bob. I know with your experience and expertise in history as a land use planner here in our region, you may know very well too that, or have a sense that is a continuing challenge. Or if, I don't know if Joe Katz, if you're here and available, I'm going to ask you to, you should be able to unmute Joe Katz. Any thoughts on that, reflection on, not to put you on the spot, but I put you on the spot. Any knowledge about that issue area, Joe, if you're able to hear us, you should be able to unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah, I'm here. I did miss part of the first part of it, so you can just repeat it back to me.
No, just the question around, there was a question about our full electrification scenario, and does it include all other public agencies, not just the cities and the county, but public universities, other state agencies, school districts, hospitals. Are we presuming our scenario suggests they will also be all electric by the horizon year? And I think at least part of Philip's response was that, there's an understanding as well that we didn't quite get to that level of detail in the analysis so far, but also too, there's knowing that a local regulation on building and development does not always necessarily applicable to other jurisdictions like a state or federal agency when it comes to development. So, sorry, that's the long way to, that was the question on the table.
Yeah, so in that vein, I mean, it's a complicated question. And from a jurisdictional standpoint, the UCs are their own jurisdiction. So when you're talking about universities, Cal State and the UCs and the community colleges have their own land use authority. So they're oriented towards the statewide targets. They also have their own targets. So that's one example in our region where probably the UC is going to be moving faster than other, especially in terms of existing construction.
Okay.
When you're talking about the other private user or private landowners, right, they're going to be subject to the local jurisdictions, right? With exceptions being like the port and the airport and things.
Right.
Airports are touchy because they have federal preemption issues and things like that. So
good. Thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. And Bob, I'll let you go ahead and unmute. Bob, you can, I'm sure you want to dive in here to clarify your thinking and point, but yeah, let us know your thoughts here about moving forward on your question.
Yeah, you asked me based on my experience. My experience has been that when a major environmental issue, in this case, an environmental crisis, comes to the fore, the state of California has been pretty aggressive in establishing regulations, not only ones that they expect to be implemented by local governments, but ones that they expect to be implemented by all state and other agencies that may not be directly under the land use authority of local governments. And you can see a number of examples of those over the years, and a lot of them are regional scale issues. And it's more efficient sometimes for the state to establish those requirements so that they're consistent across all public entities and private entities, and also could address equity implications. So anyway, I just think it would be good in your scenarios to also, perhaps your more aggressive scenario should also make some more detailed assumptions about full electrification of buildings by those other entities within the time horizon that we're looking at.
Thank you. Good, Bob. Appreciate that. Yeah, absolutely. Good point. And again, that yet another example, how we have to, again, at a regional level, working to some extent, working from and helping to inform state policy decision-making as well, and how those considerations come into play. So I see another question here. If I can ask the team to be ready to come on from Cheryl, asking about the community choice energy options, playing into better electric pricing that homeowners, and have the community choice dynamic, which is new in our region and coming online. How has that played into cost assumptions in some of these scenarios? Philip, is that part of the kind of algorithm, the calculations?
Sure, I can speak briefly to that, and I would suggest if it's possible to pull up one of the initial slides.
Sure.
Titled "Regional Emissions of Greenhouse Gases Measured in Carbon Dioxide Equivalent," and would note that among states in the Union, California has perhaps the most diverse and robust network of community choice energy and community choice aggregation policies and programs, and that they have been quite successful in advancing a variety of approaches to increasing renewable energy and electricity supply, and also supporting other programmatic changes, including building electrification, building retrofits, energy efficiency, electrification of transportation. I'll note that when we start talking about electricity supply, we're getting sort of beyond the buildings chapter a bit here, but it is quite relevant, because you see that from this figure that electricity is 20% of the overall carbon impact in the region, and much of that electricity goes to buildings. So we think of buildings as an end user of electricity, and you can sort of break out the pie differently if you wanted to reattribute the electricity across buildings.
Mm-hmm.
So we've made some assumptions about the future costs of electricity that sort of consider the local and regional context, including the existing program. Though I will say that the existing community choice electricity programmatic framework, as we've seen with fuel prices this winter, it's really anyone's guess at how to capture the volatility in energy prices when there's a lot of uncertainty in the global market. It's anyone's forecast out to 2050 is going to be wrong. So we've done our best to capture all of the local factors. I don't presume that we've gotten it perfect, but we do have in the report sort of a detailed forecast of electricity prices and how this is affected.
And then, Phil, while we have you briefly, I'm following, Cheryl's got another question here. Do we presume solar incentives, in residential would further encourage homeowners or building owners to have a better electric rate, so that, again, solar incentives would further support pushing towards decarbonization? Is that a safe assumption?
I think it's a fair assumption. Sure. I would say that, again, the electricity supply is in a different chapter and beyond the purview of our analysis.
Got it. Yeah.
Other than sort of the basic assumptions about electricity costs and electricity cost escalation over time.
Very good.
Which were an input to our analysis from the other consultants' analyses.
Right. Thank you very much. Yeah, and another good reminder, so much as for these workshops, we take a very focused approach to the specific sectors. As Philip notes here, we do also have that integrated view as well, that all of these, across these sectors, there are opportunities, policies, barriers, considerations that we have to think about across all four sectors that have been studied. And again, the workforce and jobs economy implications and opportunities as well. So there's more questions here. So Bob's, maybe Philip, you can answer the assumptions on the other GHG emitting activities in the scenarios. What do those include? I'll put that slide back up.
I think I can answer that one.
Oh, go ahead, Elise. Thank you.
Yeah, those are the other sectors in the region that emit greenhouse gases. They include things like land use and agriculture, which was also investigated in the RDF, but also things that weren't, including landfill emissions, things like emissions from marine vessels and aircraft, wastewater emissions. So it's kind of everything else that was not investigated within the energy system modeling for this technical report.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. Good, and I appreciate Hope, again, I know you're, thank you for the insight here, the suggestion about, I'm seeing here in the chat, looking at, so at least we need to come back here in a second. Bob's got another question, but Hope, your comment around, input, more data related to the airports and public works around the fix there. I know it sounds like that's an important issue to you. So thank you for that insight, that idea about how to further explore for that. Thank you. So Elise, yeah, can you explain more about why landfills emissions weren't evaluated?
Sure. Yeah, so the RDF, it drew its scope around the energy system. So it specifically looked at producers and consumers of energy. So that's why we considered buildings and transportation. And then additionally, the land use and natural climate solutions chapter was included as a way to kind of round out thinking about those sort of carbon drawdown opportunities. So landfills were just slightly outside of the scope of this report, but they are incredibly important, especially because there are a lot of methane emissions from landfills, and methane is a more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. But it was ultimately outside of the scope of this technical report.
Okay, very good. All right. Well, thank you very much. I just want to thank the team for being able to respond to a lot of great detailed questions. Again, a lot of good, really productive input from everybody here today. I wanted to, as we have on screen, I just wanted to remind you about upcoming next steps as we're finishing up this workshop here. Again, hopefully we can see you all and others at our workshop at this time, 2 o'clock next Thursday, focused on jobs specifically and workforce development. So with this broader, all this analysis around decarbonization, what does it mean, the implications around our workforce development and jobs concerned? We have heard a lot from a lot of different interests, very focused on jobs, wanting that detailed analysis. So that was an important thing for, so the county responded and put some investment into that in the context of this analysis. So please do join us to learn more about that. As you can see, again, we just posted again in the chat, thanks to Joey, the link to the project webpage where you can link to finding the reports that have been the basis for all these great presentations we've been hearing over this series of workshops. And again, the email address to link to the RDF team, zerocarbon@sdcounty.ca.gov. You see there in the chat. So again, hope to see you again at all of our upcoming sessions, any or all of our upcoming sessions coming up again next week. Also looking for the broader community meeting again on May 17 is coming up soon. And encourage you again, help us get the word out about that. Stay tuned for more on the speaker series and other broader community events. And again, looking forward to the late summer around more of an implementation focused conversation in regional convening. So please look forward to that and stay tuned and posted. So with that, I'll turn it back to Murtaza. Any kind of last concluding thoughts you want to offer the group before we let them get back to their afternoons?
Very quickly, I want to convey our county's thanks to the public agencies that have participated today. Sent your representatives, San Diego Association of Governments, and the cities of San Diego, Encinitas, Chula Vista, Solana Beach, and I missed a couple. I also want to give a shout out to some of the team members that came into this meeting that were not that visible, but they were in the background. Dr. Gordon McCord, Emily Lusky, who did the energy analysis, Scott Anders, and Nelmini Silvasen from USD EPIC. So thank you all for joining us, and really appreciate your continued support for this. Let's move forward towards implementation.
All right, very good. Thank you again to all of you for making the time, for being here. Yeah, a lot of great contributions from a lot of people here behind the scenes, and we're going to continue to keep the pace and keep this the framework moving in terms of developing the framework, the analysis, and the conversations that we're having here. So thank you for being part of it and helping to get the word out about it. We'll go ahead and say thank you, and we'll hope to see you 1 week from today, 2 o'clock, Thursday, May 5. for the focus on jobs and workforce. And, again, what a decarbonized economy may mean and what are considerations and opportunities we should be thinking about more intentionally. So please join us then. And otherwise, enjoy the rest of your afternoon as we head into the weekend. Have a good weekend, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Take care, everybody. Thank you.